Ghost stories have pervaded human societies for centuries, perhaps ever since our primitive ancestors made their first tentative steps towards civilization. Such tales overwhelmingly involve encounters with human spirits. But what particular facet of the human condition makes our spirits so prone to lingering after death? Why are ghosts always human? Why don't we see ethereal dinosaurs roaming on moonlit moors and along lonely country lanes? Well, as it would happen, it is not just humans who are condemned to endure on after death. Hello, welcome to Status Unknown. The following accounts are some notable examples of hauntings that are less human in nature. The lowly chicken might be a more resilient creature than you give it credit for. In 1945, Lloyd and Clara Olson were butchering and cleaning poultry on their farm in Colorado. Despite feeling the wrath of Lloyd's hatchet, one remarkable chicken survived and carried on living without its head. It wasn't long before the couple noticed this anomaly, at which point the chicken ran, apparently unaware of its grievous injury. It is not unheard of for chickens to continue walking after decapitation. But whereas most succumb to their injuries after a number of minutes, the Olson's chicken lived for 18 months after being beheaded. The chicken, who became known as Mike, was fed with liquid food and water dropped directly into his esophagus, and was taken on tour with a travelling circus. As bizarre as this story is, it would appear that another chicken has gone even further in its attempts to cling on to this mortal world. This story starts, surprisingly, with a well-known historical figure, Sir Francis Bacon, a notable British statesman and philosopher. In 1626, Bacon was travelling through Pond Square in Highgate, London, with his friend and associate, Dr. Witherbone. Bacon, a strong proponent of the scientific method, stopped there to test a hypothesis that cold temperatures could be used in the preservation of meat. To this end, he acquired a freshly butchered and plucked chicken to fill with snow. Although his experiment was no doubt a success of sorts, Bacon later passed away from pneumonia contracted during the experiment. A tragic turn of events, to be sure. But our story doesn't end here. Ever since that day, there have been sightings, apparitions of a pale phantom bird resembling a plucked chicken that appears in the square, the so-called Pond Square chicken ghost. One such report dates back to 1943, in the middle of the Second World War, and involves a man, Terence Long. Late at night, while passing through the deserted square, he became aware of the rhythmic sound of horses' hooves and the rumbling of carriage wheels. Before he could register what was unfolding, a shriek rang out across the square, and a phantom chicken appeared right in his path before darting around in front of him for a short while, all the while squawking and shivering with cold. The chicken, Terence claimed, then proceeded to vanish into thin air before his very eyes. Most other encounters with this entity were also reported during World War II. A local couple, Mr. and Mrs. Greenhill, lived in the square during the war and claimed to have seen the spirit on multiple occasions. They reported witnessing a big whitish bird, which was sometimes seen roosting in the tree nearby their house. Similarly, during the war, a local man was supposed to have tried catching the Pond Square phantom, but was thwarted when the bird ran straight through a brick wall. Yet another encounter with this strange avian apparition was witnessed in the 1960s by a stranded motorist, who observed that the creature appeared completely without feathers, as if it had been freshly plucked. The entity was seen again in the 1970s by a couple on a romantic walk. However, it seems that sightings have got rarer over time, and later sightings, such as in the 1970s, were devoid of any accompanying poultry noises, almost as if the entity is slowly fading away. As unusual as these accounts may be, they comprise mostly tales given by lone individuals. In the case of Terence Long, the disembodied horse and carriage noise is not unexplainable. Horse and carts were still often employed in London in the 1940s. The shared encounters of a white phantom bird could be explained by one of London's many feral bird species, especially if such a creature were encountered in the dead of night. However, the unique strangeness of these encounters, all of which were centered around Pond Square, does give some credence to the existence of this entity. We are adding this file to the archive as item number Kappa 5589. Classification: non-human astral shade. Evidence of existence: low, multiple independent witnesses. Threat level: harmless, but could potentially be a nuisance. Horses have been closely associated with humans since their domestication over 5,000 years ago. Since then, until the advent of the Industrial Revolution, horses have held an integral part in our societies. Perhaps in recognition of this fact, a notable number of drawings of large white horses can be found etched into English hillsides. The Uffington White Horse, for example, is a 110-metre-long chalk drawing that dates back to the Iron Age. Bearing this in mind, it should not be surprising that tales of phantom horses exist. This particular account of another large white horse of a more ethereal quality has all the hallmarks of a classic ghost story. It is known as the White Horse of Eastover. This tale was published in 1913 and details the encounters of the author's friend, Captain Beauclerk, who resided in London. The captain received a message from his own friend, Colonel Onslow, a retired British officer, inviting him to Easter festivities at the colonel's home, a large countryside manor known as Eastover Hall. No doubt in an attempt to entice the curiously minded Beauclerk, the colonel's message made sure to mention that his house was haunted. Although sceptical as to the truth of this claim, Beauclerk happily accepted the invitation and made his way to the colonel's home, with the last leg of his journey being made by horse and carriage provided by the ever-traditional colonel. And so Captain Beauclerk arrived via carriage to the isolated Eastover Hall on a cold and stormy April day. He noted the grand and desolate grounds surrounding the hall, and was met by an unusual coldness and an overpowering sense of melancholy. Surprisingly, although the house appeared as dark and foreboding as the grounds themselves, they failed to elicit the same reaction. After a pleasantly ordinary night and morning at the old house, the captain took to exploring the grounds in the late afternoon of the following day. It was not long before he encountered the same sensation he had felt the previous afternoon. He decided to follow the sensation, which he described akin to tracking the scent of a wild beast. Eventually, he came across the yawning mouth of a large cave, which he thought to be the source of the eerie feeling that had enthralled him. While peering into the depths of the cavern, he suddenly became aware of a faint crimson light, which, to the shock of Beauclerk, started to slowly grow in intensity until it resembled a pair of large, menacing eyes. Utterly mystified by what he was witnessing, The captain stood staring like a deer caught in the headlights as the great red eyes moved slowly towards him. He was seemingly paralyzed, whether by fear or by some power of this supernatural entity, before the nearby singing of a local village choral society snapped him out of his stupor. He then took the opportunity to bid a hasty retreat from the mouth of the cave and hurried back to the house. Once back to safety, he recounted his experiences to Colonel Onslow. The cave he had found was considered to be the most haunted spot in the grounds, and the Colonel had visited it on a number of occasions, though never alone. On every occasion, visits to the cave yielded the same eerie sensation of horror and repulsion, though a visible presence had never before been seen. Captain Beauclerk's proposed solution to this new revelation was in keeping with his military heritage: have the cave filled in, or bring the whole thing down with explosives. Unfortunately for Beauclerk, this was not something that could be arranged on a whim, and so the captain ventured to bed for what would be an unrestful night. He awoke in the early hours of the next morning to a bright moonlit night, and it was then that a new uneasy feeling came over him. He was certain that something was moving under his bedroom window. When he could no longer resist investigating his suspicions, he got up to peer through his curtains and was met with a clear moonlit view of the grounds. Whether due to lack of sleep or paranoia brought on by the previous day's events, he was sure he could momentarily see the set of red demonic eyes watching him from down in the grounds. Needless to say, sleep escaped him for the rest of the night. Onslow and Beauclerk spent the next day exploring a nearby village using the Colonel's horse and carriage. It was on their return journey that evening when a coldness once again descended upon them, a coldness that was met with some nervousness from both the men and their horse. As they drove onwards through gloomy and barren landscape on the approach back to the hall, they passed by a large, half-flooded, abandoned quarry. During his fleeting glance at the bottom of the watery pit, Beauclerk was sure he glimpsed something large and white, though the carriage was moving too fast for him to make out what it was. They had not gone much further than the end of the quarry when from behind them came an audible, drawn-out neighing noise. Having already been on edge by the last day's events, the captain whipped his head round in reaction to the sound. He was met with a most bizarre sight, the vivid outline of a huge white horse. Within moments, their own horse had bolted, seemingly in response to the presence behind them. Despite having to spend most of his concentration preventing himself from falling from the hurtling carriage, Beauclerk achieved several peeks over his shoulder. The mysterious white horse could be seen galloping along the road behind them, with a face that seemed to be contorted into what looked like a sinister grin. The creature appeared to be gaining on them even while their carriage got more and more out of control. Beauclerk reported that he saw the creature bearing down upon him with teeth ready to bite before he finally lost grip on the out-of-control carriage. With this, the captain lost consciousness. When he finally came to, he had been taken back to the safety of the hall. In total, Beauclerk and Onslow had surprisingly few injuries from the event, and Onslow claims not to have seen the entity that had seemed to wish harm upon Beauclerk. Onslow did, however, reveal that a number of prehistoric horse bones had been found in and around the old cave they had visited. They came to the conclusion that the recent paranormal events were linked to having disturbed these remains. Although this tale certainly makes for an entertaining read, the evidence to substantiate these occurrences is lacking. Beauclerk is the only individual at the hall that Easter who claimed to witness these events, and it would not at all be surprising if the captain decided to string together a ghostly tale to entertain and impress his old friend. What is more, the location of Eastover Hall and the surrounding villages cannot easily be verified, which further points to the possibility that this account was fabricated solely for entertainment. This aside, we are adding this file to the archive as item number ETA 433. Classification: non-human astral shade, high likelihood of fabrication. Evidence of existence: little to none. Threat level: reasonable. If it exists, this entity has a potential to cause bodily harm. The entities we have explored so far today have ranged from the benign yet unsettling to the outright hostile. But not all spectral encounters are held to be bad. Our next encounter takes us to the Isle of Man, a small landmass located in the Irish Sea. Despite being surrounded on all sides by either Ireland, Scotland, England or Wales, the Isle of Man retains a strong cultural history that is rooted deeply in its people's Celtic ancestry. The island is also steeped in folklore, to the extent that even the island itself is named after a Celtic sea god, Manannan, the so-called Son of the Sea. Consequently, the island is no stranger to tales of ghosts and fairies. Indeed, there have been a number of sightings of mysterious white horses akin to the supposed White Horse of Eastover. But a more pleasant tale is that of Archon Sonna, a legendary fairy spirit that is said to inhabit the island. When literally translated from the Manx language, Archon Sonna means hedgehog. However, it is also the term used to describe the spirit. If local folklore is to be believed, the fairy can alter its size, but its shape remains the same, a shape ostensibly of a pig. Witnesses have described the porcine phantom as being coloured completely white aside from its red eyes and ears, which are characteristic of most Celtic fairy animals. Interestingly, one eyewitness account even claimed that the spirit pig appeared to be wearing a little red hat, a strange sight to be sure. Although red-eyed ghosts do not conjure up the friendliest of images, this is simply not the case with Archon Sonna. Local folklore has long supposed that the spirit is an omen of good fortune, and the pig is locally known by a number of other names, such as the Pig of Plenty or Lucky Piggy. Archon Sonna can sometimes be spotted on clear moonlit nights, and it is said to bring wealth and fortune to those who observe it. To this end, local tales advise that if you're lucky enough to see the elusive white pig, keep it in your sights as long as possible. Even better fortune is granted for one who catches the fairy. It is said that if you capture the spirit, you will always find a silver coin in your pocket. Evidently then, an encounter with this entity could lead to limitless wealth, although it would be a complete nightmare for inflation experts. The origins of this legendary creature have likely been lost in the mists of time. However, there are two notable recorded sightings. On a lonely stretch of road between the rocky cliffs of Narbill Beach and the nearby hamlet of Ballacallan, there once lied a fork in the road that led to Bear Corrag, the Broken Road. In the mid-1800s, a young girl was travelling with her uncle past the turning to Bear Corrag. Lagging behind her uncle somewhat, the girl became aware of a beautiful little white pig. Delighted by the sight, as any child would be, she pursued the spirit a short way before calling to her uncle to come over and help her catch it. Rather less enthused than the girl, her uncle instructed her to leave the creature alone and assured her that it could not be caught. Eventually, though, he obliged and trudged his way back up the road to where the little girl had run, but by the time he had arrived at the spot, the creature had vanished. The second account involves another child, a boy of 12 years of age, being taken by horse and cart from the village of Dalby to the nearby town of Peel with 2 adult companions. They were making their way along the road to a bridge over the river Neb, which lied between them and their destination. Near to a secluded part of the river known as the Regat, the group passed a small stream, partially concealed by bushes. It was here where the boy noticed a strange little white pig. In delight, he pointed it out to his adult travelling companions, announcing cheerfully that the pig appeared to be wearing a little red hat. Strangely wary of what would traditionally be a good omen, the adults urged the horse onwards with further speed, remarking to each other in Manx that that's one of themselves. In response to the child's continued curiosity at the strange sight they were witnessing, the adults instructed the boy to ignore what he had seen. He was not to tell anyone about it or attempt to catch the pig if he should ever see it again. A mythical creature wearing a hat is certainly an oddity. It has been put forward that the hat was actually a missighting caused by the hasty and imperfect observation of the creature, having been spotted from a moving horse and cart. If this is the case, the red hat may well have been the creature's red ears, which have been reported on other occasions. The parallels between these 2 cases are interesting. Both occurred well before the 21st century, and both encounters with the entity took place on the road in fairly isolated stretches of the island. In both instances, it was a child who spotted the creature and reacted with instant curiosity at the sight, as one would expect. Meanwhile, their accompanying adults urged their child charges not to follow or dabble with the creatures, a surprising response to an alleged omen of good financial fortune. Was this reaction due to a general world-weary apathy of adults who don't have time to let their child chargers run amok looking for fairy tale creatures? Or was it from a more general wariness arising in the face of the unknown? Certainly, in our first case, the accompanying adults didn't actually bear witness to the entity, so it's possible that his actions were designed solely to prevent his niece from running off alone. It's likely that he never seriously considered the claims of seeing Ark and Sonna as being legitimate. Conversely, in our second case, the adults' presence did indeed see the creature. Their efforts to hasten the group's departure from the area seemed to indicate that they were keen not to encounter the entity. Ark and Sonna is, in effect, a Manx fairy tale creature, and although it still persists in local folklore, most encounters with the entity are likely forgotten. Given that only a handful of accounts are still recorded, it's hard to attest to the authenticity of this spirit. The 2 encounters listed above are fairly old, and in the first case, the only witness was a young girl. The tale was actually recorded 50 years after the event by the girl, who was now an adult. It is promising that the individual has stood by her claims well into adulthood, but this is not conclusive proof in itself. Nevertheless, we are adding this file to the archive as item number row 5589, classification, non-human fairy spirit, evidence of existence, low, multiple independent witnesses. Threat level, benevolent, said to be a good omen. Ark and Sonna is in stark contrast to a well-known omen of ill fate, a ghostly black dog, which we will discuss on another occasion. In the meantime, thanks for listening, and remember to like and subscribe. May you all find your own Ark and Sonna.